Well, joining us now for more on the latest tariff threats from Donald Trump and whether supply management may yet again be an obstacle to getting a trade deal for Canada. Very pleased to welcome to the program here David Clement. He is North American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Center, consumerchoicecenter.org. David, great to have you with us here.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, the frustration of these trade wars, these tariff tactics dragging on. I mean, it's bad news for Canadian consumers, bad news for American consumers. Just in a big sense, first of all, how frustrating is this?
Well, it's frustrating because it feels like it's economic illiteracy all the way down. So trade wars are bad. Tariffs are bad. Tariffs are taxes predominantly paid for by domestic consumers. Um, and so Donald Trump is erratic and he's tearing up the greatest trading relationship that has probably ever existed. And our government, depending on the week, is having retaliatory tariffs that are just tax increases on Canadians. And so we almost have this race to the bottom on bad economic policy. So incredibly frustrating.
It's weird, and we'll get into supply management, but maybe a bit of foreshadowing was what happened with the digital services tax, where and the Americans have been raising concern over this for a couple of years now.
Hmm.
But Donald Trump threatens to call off talks, and all of a sudden, we back away from the digital services tax. A weird way to go about policy, but I guess also kind of a win for consumers.
You're right. It's not the best way to get there, but it is a win. And the optics of Trump saying jump and Canada saying how high doesn't look great, but
Right.
it's a policy that would have been worthwhile to get rid of, regardless of who the president was, because it was genuinely bad for Canadians, and there was a ton of criticism um, on the policy in advance from Canadians saying, "Hey, this isn't a particularly good idea." Now, it's important to remember that yes, a lot of these conversations and grievances are framed within since Donald Trump took office, but the digital service tax was something that the Biden administration complained about and was
Yeah.
heavily critical of. Supply management is something that the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and then Trump again, the second time around, have complained about. So there is a bit of a disconnect because it's almost like people are forgetting that these grievances have existed for a long time. And on supply management, there seems to be collective amnesia that the trade deal with the UK fell through because of supply management. CETA was so difficult and has been slow to be ratified because of supply management. And so it's framed in the context of Donald Trump, and Canadians instinctually have this negative, visceral reaction to Trump. And I get that. I have that as well. But that doesn't mean that we have to defend everything that we do, especially when it comes with such a high cost.
Well, and what's weird too about supply management, David, and the timing of all of this, the House and the Senate both recently passed this bill C-202, a Bloc Québécois bill, no less, that legally prevents the government from even allowing supply management to be on the table in trade talks. So, on top of the fact that, as you say, it's been a trade irritant many times over for Canada, now we're almost doubling down on it.
Well, yeah, so one note on that. It doesn't prevent an act of parliament to unwind the system. It just protects it from trade concessions.
Right.
So there is still a path to get rid of it. But the issue that I have is, so a lot of people who are maybe on the fence will say, well, why would we want to open the market to the US? The Trump administration are not reliable trading partners. They've thrown decades of economic partnership and history into the trash bin. Why would we want to give them a concession here? Fine, I understand that point of view. But when Mark Carney is in the UK talking to Keir Starmer, what is one of the British grievances about Canada's markets? It's supply management. When
Right.
he's in Europe talking to Emmanuel Macron, I guarantee you that Emmanuel Macron is wondering why we don't have so many French cheeses on Canadian grocery shelves. It's because of supply management. And so no matter how you want to cut this, if we're going to look elsewhere, everywhere we've looked elsewhere has pointed to supply management and said, hey, we would like access to that market in any type of trade deal. And so the idea that we're going to isolate ourselves now for 10,000 or so farmers just seems so incredibly economically short-sighted, and it just really disappointing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting because I think people maybe who don't follow this, and you hear the concerns. This is about protecting farmers or farms, and I think people are sympathetic to that. But some of the biggest critics of our position, the biggest critics of Bill C-202, have been others in the ag sector, right? They rely
Mhm.
heavily on exports, and they're very worried about what this is doing to our trade agreements.
Exactly. And I've highlighted this over and over and over again because I will see this all the time. Well, if we open up our market, it will get dominated by the Americans, and that will be the end of Canadian dairy. Well, the fun thing is, we already have tried that, and we know that it didn't end up in disaster. We have an open market for American beef. It accounts for, I think, less than 13% of the total market. And we're a tenth of the size of the United States. We don't have supply management for anything else in the ag sector,
Right.
and yet we haven't been completely overrun with American products. And just because something is allowed to enter the country doesn't mean that consumers are going to buy it. That's where the competition aspect comes into play, and where we really see the benefits is because all of a sudden, rather than just having milk from one country and one source, you have competition on grocery shelves, and it can include American products. It can include New Zealand products. It can, like I use the example of Kerrygold butter from Ireland, which is incredibly popular worldwide. Impossible to get here because even if it does get here, it's slapped with a 200 to 300% tariff, and so it's priced out of the market.
One of the weird arguments too from defenders of the system, because we got the Kuzma deal with the U.S. that allowed a little bit of a concession for the Americans on these issues, and defenders of supply management say, well, we don't need to make any more concessions because the Americans aren't meeting that limit, and yet if we make another concession, somehow we're going to be overrun with American products. Like that seems like a contradictory argument.
Yeah, so we have this all the time whenever I talk to the supporters of supply management because they'll say, without realizing the cognitive dissonance, they'll say, well, no, US milk isn't cheaper than Canadian milk. While at the same time arguing that if we allow more US milk, it's going to hurt Canadian farmers. Well,
Right.
wait a second. It can't be both, right? And if it isn't cheaper, then why worry? And the same thing about the quality of US agricultural products, which is predominantly a myth. But if it is worse quality, then what's the threat, right?
Yeah.
Canadians would just naturally not pick the suboptimal products if the quality is really that bad. Again, just because something can enter the country, I mean, I use the example of spam. Spam exists. I think it's gross. But the existence of spam doesn't, and the allowance of it on a grocery store shelf doesn't mean that it's completely cannibalizing the market for anything that would be comparable. It just exists, and some people like it, and a lot of people don't.
Exactly. But for Canadians who don't understand how supply management works, I mean, it's a really weird, archaic system where we've got quotas, we've got price controls, we've got tariffs, we've
Mhm.
got product that goes to waste each year. It's a weird system.
Incredibly weird system. I mean, I would argue that it doesn't. So the idea that it meets that that the government magically ensures that supply meets demand is false. The research on this has shown that there are billions of liters that have been dumped since 2012, which is an economic cost. It's an environmental cost because there are emissions associated with producing. Um, the idea that it's protecting the family farm is false. Did the dairy industry, I use that as that's primarily what we're talking about, has consolidated like the rest of the agricultural sector over the last 20 years. So that's not true. The only thing that is true is it provides a stable income for these protected farmers, which is true. But I'll put this back to you. Maybe you know the answer, or maybe you don't. What is the net income? So after expenses, income for your average quota holder.
Well, those are valuable quotas. I know that.
Yeah. So the average income for a quota holder, according to Statista, is about $250,000 a year after
Yeah.
expenses. So it's not like we have supply management and dairy farmers are like scraping by on really modest means and really struggling to make a go of it. It's become a golden ticket. And yeah, I understand they're going to fight tooth and nail to try and protect this, and they've been doing this for a decade. We're both old enough to remember the conservative leadership campaign many years ago, where it was front and center, and they
Right.
rallied and helped tip the scale in favor of Andrew Scheer. And so, for me, it's just this really, really outdated policy that benefits, in the grand scheme of Canadians, it benefits 10,000 or so supply managed farmers. And the costs are, it's incredibly hard for us to trade with the Europeans, with the British, with the Americans, with the Australians or the Kiwis. But then domestically, it inflates prices between 20 and 40%, depending on the product and the season. And that in turn pushes upwards of 189,000 Canadians under the poverty line when we have record numbers of people lining up at food banks because they're struggling to make ends meet. And so for me, it's just a no-brainer in terms of something that we should consider getting rid of. Yes, it would be uncomfortable to give Trump a win, but it would be for our own good.
Yeah. What about, and it's almost like a two wrongs don't make a right kind of argument, but I mean, the US has its own agriculture protectionist type policies, subsidies to
Mhm.
farmers, a lot of really weird quotas and tariffs around sugar, for example. Does that
Mhm.
in any way justify Canada's position here, justify supply management?
No. No, it doesn't. And it doesn't because, I mean, Martha Hall Findlay has done some great myth busting on this, showing
Mhm.
the subsidies. Because I see this myth perpetuated all the time that, well, it means that we don't give our dairy farmers subsidies. Well, we did in
Right.
2019, 1.75 billion in exchange for access to the Canadian market, which is a subsidy, and government protection is a subsidy. If I were to add an inflated cost to all of the other podcasts or radio shows, and the only one that wasn't faced with that cost was you, that would be a subsidy to you and your
Right.
show. In that case, it might be worth it in comparison to what else is out there, but it is a subsidy because protection is a form of subsidy. And so I get the criticisms of the Farm Bill and some U.S. agricultural policy and sugar policy in particular in the U.S., but that's not a justification for hurting ourselves. In the same way that Trump having a economically illiterate view on tariffs is not justification for us to match it, right? Don't match bad policy with bad policy. In fact, if you look at Australia, in all of the hoopla of the tariffs, the prime minister there stood in front of parliament and said, I'm not going to retaliate. And yeah, I get that the optics suck here, but tariffs are paid for by you. And why am I going to increase taxes on Australians because there happens to be someone very silly in the White House? And so that would be my argument. Yeah, the U.S. can have their farm bill and some of the silliness that they have, but that doesn't mean we have to match it or maintain our own silliness.
We'll see where this all goes from here. Much more is mentioned. ConsumerChoiceCenter.org. David, thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.